So let me first welcome Ms. Carol Thompson-Cole, President and CEO of Venture Philanthropy Partners. Ms. Nikki Gorin, President and CEO of the Eugene and Agnes E. Meyer Foundation.
Hi, Nikki. Sure.
And George Jones, Chief Executive Officer of Bread for the City.
All right, great. Now that you got your mics. Great, well thanks so much, George, Nikki, Carol, for joining me here. And so this is our first of 3 panels, right? We focused on advancing missions amid the new philanthropy model, right? And so we've only got 20 minutes, so we're going to keep it kind of rapid fire, right? Talk fast. But our first area is around investment versus charity, and I'm going to go to you first, George. You know, from our vantage point as an agency, we see 2 big shifts: how nonprofit impact is being measured, and the number and the variety of sources of funding available to those nonprofits. So I think the question for you and your role as leading a nonprofit and your role as on boards of nonprofits, right, is how are those organizations reacting and adapting to be seen as investments versus charities if they are? And I have an offshoot of that for you guys, or jump in however you wish.
Yeah, I think that there's always been the challenge, at least from my perspective. I've been at Bread for almost 20 years now. It's always been the challenge of trying to think about, you know, the idea of making sure you make the most out of the support you get. So this notion of return on investment has always been a little bit important to, it's always been very important to Bread. Sure. I think that the individual sector, the sort of individual donors, have oftentimes responded to the messages, the stories that are about sort of, you know, the charitable inspiration to help. So if there's a place for that. Sure. But I think in the foundation community and with corporations, we've always had the challenge of making a clear case for what the return on investment is. At Bread recently, one of the things that we've been looking at is we've got an initiative called a City Orchard, where we have a 3-acre orchard out in Beltsville, Maryland, and we estimate we'll bring about 50,000 pounds of fresh produce back into the city for the families who live in low-income communities that we serve. The question we've been trying to ask is it better to take the money we're getting from funders and just purchase that, or are there other sort of residual returns we're looking for from having that orchard and having volunteers? Is that the better use? We haven't answered that question yet, but that's the kind of question we ask quite often at Bread. Right,
so when an organization's sort of wrestling with that and sort of the rise, you know, I think about the rise of impact investment, how do you, folks like you, how are you reacting and changing how you're evaluating nonprofits when they're contemplating hard decisions like that in terms of whether they should receive funding and so forth?
Venture Philanthropy Partners is a philanthropic investment organization. We're about 14 years old, and VPP was actually started as a different way of doing philanthropy. And so our investors are primarily business leaders. They are technologists and venture capitalists. And so when they came into this, they really wanted to bring the business lens to high-performing nonprofits. And so they did not want to just write checks, but they wanted to be engaged. They wanted to make sure that they were using their time, their talent, and their connections to really help these organizations go to the next level. So for VPP, we don't send out requests for proposals. We're constantly looking throughout this community for organizations that are high-performing, serving children and youth of low-income families. We do significant due diligence on the organizations. We have in our selection process a business planning process, and that helps us to get to know the organizations, make sure that what they want to do is plausible and is possible, and then we go shoulder to shoulder with them, bringing money as well as bringing strategic assistance from people like myself to work with the organizations to go to their next levels of aspiration.
Nikki, what are your thoughts on that, the evaluation thereof?
You know, I think there's a spectrum. I think the first thing I would say is, we've questioned a number of nonprofit leaders, including Schroeder, who's not here today. We've questioned this idea of charity versus investment in general, whether you're an individual philanthropist or a foundation, and the thought that when you're thinking about it simply as charity, you're not really viewing or expecting as much out of your investment as you would when you think about providing those dollars to really make change in community. And I think just as a society, we need to think about all of our philanthropic dollars as investments in the people in our communities and in the nonprofits that are supporting them. I think at the Meyer Foundation, we haven't as a foundation to date been as focused on hardcore evaluation as maybe VPP has. But I would say that I think it's really important for the Meyer Foundation as a foundation to be able to say, to what end are we, why are we making these grants, and what are we trying to achieve in the community, and therefore be able to ask our grantees, what are you accomplishing? And I agree with your earlier comments. I don't think it's enough to say, these are all the things we're going to do over the next year. These are our activities. I think you need to be able to say, this is what we're going to accomplish, and this is how we're going to be able to show it. And that's how we evaluate outcomes. But I would say, probably going to one of your later questions, I also think there's a real opportunity now to maybe move beyond, and I think VPP has done some of this, move beyond the organization by organization stringent program by program evaluation requirements and thinking, and think more holistically as a community. What together are we going to accomplish it? What goals do we want to set together, and how are we going to measure our collective impact against those goals?
All right, well, let me pick up on something you said just maybe 20 seconds before that, and pivot to communications as enabler, kind of our second pod here of topic. And I think I'm interested in your take on, we know that nonprofits are constantly challenged to focus on the cause, the mission of the work. And I think that can be sometimes at the expense of the expenses, like, say, communications or another enabling element. And so I'm curious, and it doesn't matter really who started, maybe with you folks, as you're evaluating, should I make a direct cause investment, through the stringent analysis? Or should I make an enabler type investment and invest in letting them or helping them to tell the story better? How do you make that call?
Well, Venture Philanthropy Partners is a capacity building, infrastructure building investment organization. And so we find that the organizations that we serve, they are very successful in getting the program money. Yep. But it's how do they get the pieces of their work that sustain the program? And so we've said early on that we were not going to be angel or startup organization investments. We would be more mezzanine level investments. And so many of those organizations have been very good at what they've done, but they have been stuck because they needed that infrastructure in their capacity in order to get to the next level. And so we have invested in communications. We want to make sure that they do communicate the passion and what they're actually doing, so that, as you said earlier, they can really get people engaged in what they're doing to help them advance their mission.
Yeah, and I would echo that. Meyer Foundation, actually, all of our quote-unquote program grants are general operating support grants to begin with, so they're not tied to specific activities, and we're investing in nonprofits and programs that we believe are going to have outcomes in the community, and we're giving them very flexible support to do it. And in addition, we make available what we call management assistance grants to our grantees to enable them to build capacity over and above what the general operating support will do for everything from strategic planning to communications to fundraising, because we know that it's critical that we have to, as a philanthropic community, stop seeing those things as overhead and see them as critical to the mission of the organizations that we're supporting, because we'll never get to the scale of solutions that we want to see if we continue to constrain nonprofits by only funding program and not enabling them to put these things in place, as well as the infrastructure to be able to really go big. Right. So that's just a basic philosophy of the Meyer Foundation.
Right, and so I think a riff off of that is, so as you're sort of running the nonprofit or observing nonprofits being run, how are they wrestling with that, striking that balance between doing the day-to-day cause work, but needing to know that there's an investment at some point that's valuable in telling the story. How do you strike that balance?
Well, I think most of us, many of us, don't have a good balance on that. We probably do sort of lean heavily towards sort of focusing on the work. And even when we tell the stories, we tell them through proposals, so we tell them to the funders. But the implication of what you're saying is that there's a broader audience and perhaps other people who might invest in the organization if we put both resources and a focus on telling our stories to the broader audience, being intentional about it and using some of our resources. Breathitt City just actually did a contract with a local radio station, $12,500 contract, which is probably small.
Yeah.
It's small for us. We're a $9 million organization, so it's not a huge amount of money. Yeah. But it was probably an unprecedented amount for us to even spend on a marketing campaign, and it was to reach a particular audience, the people of color who are of means. Yeah. It was a radio station targeted because we thought that audience could be reached through that portal, and they hadn't been supporters for us historically, or at least not at the rate that we wanted. And so we made that investment, and we took it from general support because we thought, you got to really do this if you're going to broaden the levels of support and investment.
And it was an aspect, it seems, that was sort of exploratory, and you were willing to take that leap, right?
That's right. So we've been grappling with them about trying to figure out how to determine the impact of it. Yeah. I mean, the radio station hasn't necessarily come up with a perfect solution for the saying, what is that? And I've said to them, you know, if we're going to make this investment again next year, one of us is going to have to figure out whether or not this made a difference.
Right.
Right.
Fair enough, right?
Can I just add a couple things? One, just to put a plug for something you mentioned early on, the Stories Worth Telling, which the Meyer Foundation put out a report in collaboration with Georgetown University, and it's a great resource for small nonprofits on how to tell your story. And I think, we're looking into what comes after this in terms of building resources to support that work, because it's very important. But it's an example of where the Meyer Foundation has invested in over several months training for nonprofit leaders in how to tell their stories, because we see the value in communicating that. And then the only other thing which I will say is, again, to one of your earlier points, the other thing we see is very often nonprofits, particularly small nonprofits, saying, we want to invest in communications, we want to redo our website, we want to get a social media strategy, but haven't really done the work that you mentioned in your introduction about really being able to articulate what are we trying to accomplish in our community. And I just want to stress that you cannot build a communications plan on activities. Yeah. You have to be able to articulate what you're about and why you're there and what you're accomplishing. And so often what we will say is, have you thought about doing some strategy work and clarifying your key goals and therefore your key messages before you undertake this communications work? So I just wanted to stress that.
No, it's great. And
I'd like to add the fact that I think one of the biggest challenges is everyone is now asking for measurable results. Everyone wants to see outcomes. And so you've got to have that, but you have to strike the right balance on how you tell the story and how those stories tie to the outcomes, that people can really see the impact that you're trying to accomplish.
Great. Yeah, I think we see more and more of that. And so it's a nice, actually, bridge to the next section, sort of what lies ahead, and maybe what's happening today. So I think we see hundreds of thousands of nonprofits in this country doing incredible work. Maybe you could argue that the demands on those services are even greater, say, post-financial crisis. Yet we know that, at least as a percentage of GDP, you can see certain studies that say, well, historically about 2% goes to kind of fuel that engine that is nonprofit work. Okay, been stagnant for years. So what's going to change? Like, what is the big sort of seismic shift that will occur maybe in the next decade regarding how nonprofits are run, how funders are funding? What are the quantum leaps that you see occurring, say, in the next decade on the funding side and then on the management side and the interplay? Go ahead.
So I have great aspirations for this. Just for sake of full disclosure, I've been at the Meyer Foundation 3 months. So I'm, I'm moving forward. But I think, looking at the DC region in particular, where we know we have these challenges around decreased funding, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, closing of many of our, big foundation partners. that's a big challenge, and we know that the income inequality is growing and economic opportunity is decreasing for low-income residents, and so the barriers are seemingly getting greater, but I think that presents a real opportunity for our community to take a big step back and think very differently. And I think that includes funders, it includes nonprofits, it includes government, private sector. We have a growing, more vibrant business sector that I think is untapped in our region and unharnessed. Yeah. And so, I know it's maybe viewed as jargon to talk about collective impact, but I do believe that that is the way we need to think for the future, that we all kind of need to break down our internal silos, break down our sector silos, and identify issues where there are outcomes that we can get to and that we can agree on and come together and figure out where each of us plug in and work on it together, because otherwise I don't think that we can solve the problems that our region is facing. So I think that's the big opportunity, and that's where, that's where I'm hoping Meyer will play a role.
Carol, your thoughts on the George?
Well, Nikki has given me the perfect segue. I would say collaboration, and that's something that we've wanted for a long time, but we find it's one of the hardest things to accomplish. And so in 2010, VPP applied to the Social Innovation Fund, and we came up with a collaboration that we wanted to build called Youth Connect, where we really were going to take several organizations and bring them together to focus on one issue and see how they could bring their success and their passion to really help many more kids. Because we figured out if we just continue to work with individual organizations, they'll be better and they'll serve more kids, but it really won't address the intractable problems that they're facing. And so we have 6 organizations, 4 that we had worked with and pre-selected, 2 that came through an open competition, and then we created a common outcomes framework. And that took a year. It's unbelievable, but it took a year. And then we brought the program people, the EDs, and the evaluation staff, and the communications, and we created working groups for each of them. We set out at the beginning that we would impact 20,000 of what was in 2010, 135,000 disconnected youth from employment and education. And we said that these 6 organizations with VPP would impact 20,000 of those young people. We are now in year 4, and they are really working together. They each had money to work on something in their organization, which was an innovation or breaking down barriers. But then they came together for the network. We're in our practice venue in the 3rd semester at the Career Academy at LAYC, and we have served 17,000 young people, and we believe we will meet or exceed the 20,000. And they will continue to work together. And so our work going forward is going to be about the promise and power of networks. And we're really going to take this to the next level and build, support, and prepare high potential organizations to be ready to work with high performing nonprofits. So some of these problems will not exist for these kids in 10 to 15 years.
Right, and so George, are you ready to collaborate? I mean, I guess you got to get ready here, right?
Right, we're ready to collaborate. I agree with all of that, but I think when I read the question, it had the word radical in it, and I was like, okay, radical, that's an interesting idea. And one of the things I was thinking is, there's been a kind of a tug of war for we nonprofits between the public sector and the private sector, each trying to figure out who's on first. And they wanted the other entity to be on first, by the way. So the government wants the private funding community to be the sustainable source. They want to be the source taken out, and vice versa. Private sources want the government to be the sustainable source, so when we nonprofits go to them, we're both they both ask us, so how are you going to replace our funding? And you fill in the blank about whatever year. So that's been an interesting quandary. I'm not sure actually the most radical thing that might happen in the next decade or so is, I hope it's not funding. I hope it is public policy that really shifts in a way that starts to address some of these intrinsic and persistent issues around poverty, for instance, which is a Bread for the City issue. The other piece that I think is perhaps going to be radical and something that Bread is trying to be a part of is a movement to engage the folks who we serve in the work that we do in ways that are more of a partnership. Bread, has been a service model organization for 40 years, but we are really grappling with how to change the paradigm from service to partnership, from engaging people in the work we do, which means having them take leadership roles. And so, and in the district, we've got 200,000 low-income people. That's a lot of person power. You know, you can move mountains with that number of people. I think the civil rights movement understood that having the people who were affected by that movement in the streets, showing up to move public opinion and public policy, I think that that's the next radical thing, is a kind of return to that kind of work, and Brett's trying to do some of that.
Thanks, George. So the numbers don't lie, right, Carol? We're coming down on it. So I just want to thank you for taking the time. I know you guys are incredibly busy, and it's almost ridiculous that we asked you to do this, right? But thank you for coming, and I know you guys, some of you have to leave early, but thank you so much, and we're going to move on to panel 2.
Thank you so much.